Well, welcome everyone to another dose of science. Today, it's only Jonathan and me for various reasons, some illnesses, some commitments, but nevertheless, we are going to make it worth your while. I will talk today about chiropractic, which is a very, very interesting modality of treatment. And Jonathan will look behind the scenes of the Pfizer vaccine and some of the silliness that has been said. But just to get things started, I mean, this past week we had information that the Merck drug, which is a drug to essentially keep you out of the hospital, an oral pill, and it looks very good in the preliminary studies. And Pfizer also has a prospective drug that, again, will be oral. So far, of course, in terms of antiviral therapy, there has been remdesivir, but that has to be given in the hospital and it's intravenous. So the question is to come up with a pill that someone can take if they experience the first symptoms and they can stay at home just taking this oral version. And the Merck pill is practically a go. They've asked for emergency approval from FDA, which is likely to be granted. And the trial results have been very, very good. The mechanism of action is an interesting one. The drug actually has a resemblance to a nucleoside. Nucleosides are the building blocks of RNA. And it just incorporates itself into the RNA of the virus and it causes mutations and the virus doesn't reproduce properly. There are questions about it. Some people are concerned that in the trial, people were asked to ensure that there's no pregnancy possible, to use contraceptive or to just refrain from engaging. And some people say that this is because they have some suspicion that there might be some kind of effect on on conception. Merck says no, that is not the case. So anyway, we will see. But the trial data look very good. The Pfizer drug, which is a bit further down the line, is a different mode of action. It's a protease inhibitor. It inhibits an enzyme that the virus needs to reproduce. But it is also oral, and that would be, a great advance. As expected, both Merck and Pfizer shares reflected the optimistic results. But again, neither of them is on the market yet. The Merck is close to approval, so it's a question of wait and see. And it is going to add to the armamentarium. And if it can help keep people out of the hospital, that of course is going to be a huge benefit. So that's where we stand, and we'll have updates on this as get closer and closer to approval, and hopefully some epidemiological evidence once it's out there in the marketplace. Both of these are cheaper than the drugs that are used now. They're cheaper than monoclonal antibodies. And obviously, it's a huge economic benefit if people can be treated at home, not having to go to the hospital. Now, it looks like we are on the verge of another scientific breakthrough, as we have indeed had with the vaccine. Okay, let's switch to Jonathan, who's going to glance behind the scenes of the...
Yeah, so I want to talk about Pfizer Gate because this was sort of all over social media, especially on the French side. There was a lot of rumbling about this in France, but this started in the U.S. And this is a very interesting story. It's a story about something that really snowballed well beyond the allegations. It's also a story about how framing by a certain journalist can turn something that is, of certain significance into something that is much, much more significant. So, what I'm about to show is not true, but you will be forgiven for thinking that it was, and maybe you have heard some of these allegations. Apparently, there's a planet-wide scandal that has erupted. The clinical trials for Pfizer's COVID-19 vaccine were rigged and they cannot be trusted. The CEO of the company was just arrested by the FBI for fraud. And so, of course, the use of Pfizer's COVID-19 vaccine must be suspended. Those are sort of the allegations that are in the water, that are spreading around on social media. So, what actually happened? This is what happened. So the British Medical Journal, also known as the BMJ, which is a very well-regarded science journal, published an investigation called COVID-19. Researcher blows the whistle on data integrity issues in Pfizer's vaccine trial. This was published on November 2nd, and we will come back to who the author of this piece was. But essentially, to summarize the allegations in this piece, there's a regional director who was employed for 2 weeks by a research organization that ran some of Pfizer's testing sites for the clinical trial of Pfizer's vaccine. And this person who was there alleges falsified data within the research organization, alleges the unblinding of patients, and I'll go into more details about this, about inadequately trained vaccinators, a slow response on adverse events reported. So an adverse event is any kind of bad effect, potentially harmful, that happens after, in this case, a vaccine is administered that may or may not have been caused by the vaccine. So that's what an adverse event is. And apparently they were very slow to respond to those. Claims that the staff over there was overwhelmed by the volume of problems that they were finding. This research organization called Ventavia, I'm not sure, they fired this whistleblower, this regional director, the day that she emailed a complaint about this to the Food and Drug Administration in the United States. And this email complaint went over, observations that some participants who were getting the vaccine or the placebo, that they were placed in a hallway post-injection. They were not being monitored for any sort of adverse event. There was a lack of timely follow-up when adverse events were declared. There were protocol deviations that were not reported. The vaccines were not being stored at a proper temperature. Lab specimens were mislabeled. And the staff at the organization that reported these types of problems were being targeted by the company. The piece also quotes, I believe there's a couple of anonymous former employees of Ventavia who apparently confirmed to the reporter broad aspects of this complaint. And the last allegation is that the FDA is severely under-resourced to show up and to inspect when a complaint is actually made. So, this sounds very worrisome when you summarize it in this way. And I want to direct our viewers to two responses that were published to this piece. The first one by Dr. David Gorski, whom we had on this webcast something like a year ago, who writes for Science-Based Medicine. The other is a write-up by Skeptical Raptor, who does some very good work writing skeptically about science and about pseudoscience. And both of them noticed some interesting things about these allegations and about the way in which these allegations were written up and how they were framed in this BMJ investigation piece. And I will be summarizing a lot of the points that they've made in their respective pieces. And I think the lesson here is that you don't even have to lie, right? Although you can lie, and there are some things that we could argue are lies in this BMJ piece. But you can also just frame your story a certain way and sort of guide your readers through the inferences that they will make into the destination that you want them to. And the way in which the story is framed is basically, well, we can't really trust this Pfizer vaccine anymore because of these allegations. So to provide a bit of context, when a big company like Pfizer organizes a massive clinical trial for one of their vaccines, for example, they do not have the human resources to organize all of that by themselves. They will often recruit what are called contract research organizations, or CROs, to handle some of the management of the trials at a more local level. And those CROs can then also hire other organizations under them to supervise specific testing sites. So Ventavia is one of those companies that Pfizer had a contract with to run some of the sites where volunteers came to and were vaccinated either with the vaccine or with the placebo during Pfizer's phase 3 clinical trial for their COVID-19 vaccine. And it's important to point out that Ventavia was responsible for 3 of those testing sites. There were many other testing sites that were not under Ventavia's purview. The allegations that have been made in this BMJ piece have only to do with Ventavia and the sites that they supervised. So, for example, in the BMJ piece, talking about framing, we are told that for researchers who were testing Pfizer's vaccine at several sites in Texas during that autumn, speed may have come at the cost of data integrity and patient safety. The journalist is using here the phrase several sites. Now, it's 3 sites out of 153 that participated in that clinical trial, the data of which led to the approval, to the authorization of that vaccine. So yes, technically 3 sites. Yeah, you can say several sites, but hopefully you can see that by saying several sites and not saying, well, it was 3 sites out of a total of 153, you are led to believe that this problem was much larger than it actually was. The first item that is mentioned in this piece is that this woman, this regional director who became a whistleblower, she documented some of the problems that she saw at Ventavia. And one photo showed needles that were discarded in a plastic biohazard bag instead of a sharps container box. Now, that is a problem. It's a genuine problem because whoever is handling the waste could risk getting a needle stick injury. So this is bad lab practice and it needs to be fixed. But of course, that in and of itself has no bearing on the safety or the efficacy of the vaccine. But we're still told this in the context of there were problems there that may make us question the safety and efficacy of this vaccine. And in fact, when Dr. Gorski wrote about this, he said that this accusation seems to have been inserted at the beginning in order to provide what he wants to call a yuck factor, right? To get the readers to feel disgust on a visceral level towards the company. Oh my, they did this, before going into claims that are a bit more mundane and a bit more difficult to explain. We are told in the first paragraph of this BMJ investigation that one of the problems that this whistleblower is blowing the whistle on is that the patients were unblinded. So blinding in a clinical trial means that the people who are receiving either the vaccine or the placebo, they don't know which of them they are getting. And the person that is doing the administering the vaccine or the placebo likewise does not know. That is a double-blinded situation. Now, there's a code, of course, that will reveal to the right people eventually who got what so that they can analyze the data and see. But blinding is very important because you want to reduce the biases. I mean, if I'm part of a clinical trial and I know for a fact that I've received the vaccine, I may be tempted to act in a more risky fashion, thinking that I must be protected because I got the vaccine. And the opposite might be true, that if I know that I got the placebo, I might take fewer risks. So in order to minimize that, patients are blinded, they don't know what they get. The people administering it are also blinded as well. So we are told that the patients were unblinded, which would be bad. But then later on, it's specified that no, actually they were not. We don't know for a fact that they were unblinded. It was that this code that I mentioned was left in some folders, and some of the people might have been able to see it. So it was a potential unblinding. So we are sort of lied to at the beginning. It's made out to be a bigger problem than it's been actually documented to be. So there's potential unblinding, which is bad, of course, but it's not the same thing as claiming that the patients were literally unblinded. Another claim that is being made is that not everybody got tested for COVID. So during this trial, of course, we want to know, do people who get the vaccine, do they have are there fewer cases in that group of COVID-19 versus the group that got the placebo? And in order to know that is when you have symptoms of COVID-19, we insert the Q-tip up the nose, we send it to the lab and we test for COVID-19. And not everybody, according to this whistleblower, got the swab. And we are told that the full trial swabs were not taken from 477 people with suspected cases of symptomatic COVID-19, which again sounds like a lot. And then there's one of these employees that says, I don't think it was good, clean data. It's a crazy mess. Now, a good journalist would have contextualized this figure and said, well, this is 477 patients out of over 40,000 participants who were part of this clinical trial. Moreover, the percentage of participants who were not tested via swab, because that does happen, it's a big trial, and sometimes, some balls get dropped here and there. The percentage of participants who were not tested via swab was actually similar in both treatment and placebo group. Pfizer knew about this. They took this into consideration, and it was about 10% in each group. But again, that is not mentioned here. Another concern that is raised by this whistleblower is that the vaccines are not being stored at proper temperatures. We remember that, especially at the beginning, Pfizer's vaccine had to be kept at minus 70 degrees Celsius. We are told it's not being stored at proper temperatures. But how many of these vaccines were not stored at proper temperatures? At what temperature were they actually stored? How big of a gap was it between the actual temperature and the minus 70? How often did this happen? We don't know. So, I don't want to minimize what is being alleged here, because bad practices in the running of a clinical trial, it needs to be addressed. I mean, this is not good, to be perfectly honest. This is really not good. It needs to be fixed. But the allegations that are in there, even if they are true, would actually have very little to no bearing on the safety efficacy of the vaccine itself. For example, this claim that the vaccines was kept at the wrong temperature. Let's imagine that this was done a lot at these particular at these three sites. Well, the vaccine would not be very efficacious, and so if anything, the vaccine would have looked less efficacious than it actually is. And we remember that the result from this phase 3 trial was that Pfizer's vaccine was efficacious. I believe it was something like 94%. So again, these allegations, which are important to investigate, but even if they are true, they would have little to no bearing on the safety efficacy of the vaccine. Again, this was 3 out of 153 sites. Pfizer's vaccine has been given over 251 million doses just in the United States. In fact, I wrote about this back in July, about how we know that the vaccines work in the real world, and a lot of the data that we have is actually on Pfizer's vaccine. So we have real world data on its safety, on its efficacy. So while those allegations are, they need to be investigated, we can't take that and say, well, then the vaccine absolutely does not work and it's dangerous. No, we have a ton of data well outside of that to reassure us that it is, in fact, safe and effective. So now, who wrote this investigation for the British Medical Journal? The journalist who wrote this is Paul Thacker. So Paul Thacker is an American journalist. His Wikipedia page informs us that he has written for Science, for the Journal of the American Medical Association, for Salon, the New Republic, and for Environmental Science and Technology. Dr. Stephen Novella, who's a skeptic, who's a neurologist, and who also writes for Science-Based Medicine, wrote that actually Thacker was fired from the journal Environmental Science and Technology for showing an anti-industry bias. Paul Thacker does not like the industry, does not trust any research that comes out of industry. He has anti-GMO views. He has harassed scientists who work on genetically engineered food in the past. He has promoted 5G conspiracy theories. Joe, I believe you know of him. Is there anything that you want to add about Paul Thacker?
He's, yeah, I wouldn't say he's one of a kind, because there are many of this kind. And it's a rather common technique to cast dispersion on a company by coming up with something that there really may be, an issue with, and then suggesting that therefore there's an issue with the company as a whole. It's a technique very often used by what we call the ambulance chasing lawyers. Mm-hmm. And when they go after a pharmaceutical company, alleging that a certain drug, should be withdrawn, or, they're trying to get a settlement because someone has been hurt by that drug, they will then look at the company's history and find, perhaps a drug that there really was a problem with, and highlight that. And therefore, try to get people to infer that this means that everything that they do is questionable. Mm-hmm. And that really is what Thacker does. He finds these little pieces of half-truths, and then, of course, impugns the company because of them. So, yeah, I mean, we see this kind of technique all the time, is to find some little mistake, and therefore, try to convince people that therefore everything that they do is a mistake.
Right. Now, just as I finish here, You may be wondering, well, this was published in the famous British Medical Journal. This is a paper that has a journal that has such a strong history. I mean, shouldn't we just simply believe whatever is published in the BMJ? Well, no, I mean every publication, sometimes they have a history of publishing some really good stuff, and sometimes some stuff that is much more questionable. Speaking of, Joe will be talking about chiropractic care. So this is from, again, published in the BMJ in 2017. It's a review of complementary medicine in the management of headache, and they say that, well, chiropractic care may also be beneficial for my migraine headache. One of the senior editors of the BMJ, Peter Doshi, according to Dr. Gorski, has been casting doubt on vaccine safety and efficacy since 2009. Some of his articles are so anti-vax that they've been reprinted verbatim on the website of Robert F. Kennedy Jr., who is one of the leading voices of the modern anti-vaccination movement. So just because something is in the BMJ, just because something is in the Lancet, in the New England Journal of Medicine, does not necessarily mean that it is good, robust, and true. About this rumor that remember at the beginning I said that apparently the CEO of Pfizer was arrested for committing fraud. So Forbes here reports that this allegation actually comes as an exclusive to the website called Conservative Beaver. They're the ones who broke this quote unquote news. So I had to look, what is the Conservative Beaver? So it's conservative news, Canadian style. We bring you stories that matter, the ones that you won't hear about on the mainstream networks. It was started in a University of Ottawa dorm room, I guess. It eventually spread through our city as an underground newspaper. And now it's a website. And I had a quick look, and some of their articles are perfectly fine. Others beggar belief. So that's where this rumor came from. There's no evidence that the CEO of Pfizer has been arrested by the FBI. So what we have here is the story of someone who worked at Ventavia for 2 weeks and who allegedly witnessed bad practices. And that story has now been turned into this global conspiracy to hide the lack of effectiveness and the harmful nature of Pfizer's vaccine. So the vaccine is safe and effective, but this phenomenon is so frequent now on social media, where there is a seed of truth to something, and that seed gets turned into a bit of a snowball, and it rolls down the hill and it picks up steam. And the people who want this to be true, want this to be part of a larger narrative, they hop in, and it gets turned into this giant snowball. And before you know it, PfizerGate is trending on Twitter. And that's what this is all about.
This is the kind of thing that we see all the time now, where you have these, people up on their soapboxes, spreading misinformation. And then to be truthful, on the other side, we have the pharmaceutical companies that also stretch the truth.
Sure, yeah.
So the truth is somewhere in between, but it's never halfway in between. It's always closer to one extreme than the other. So, of course, the reason that people come here is because we have the truth, right? Okay, let's switch gears now. Let me just share my screen here and talk about what is actually the most widely practiced form of alternative medicine. Of course, the question is, what do we mean by alternative medicine? The best definition of that is that this is medicine that is not taught in medical school because there is not enough evidence to teach it. It does not mean that it cannot work or it does not work. It just means that there is not enough evidence that it does. And chiropractic falls into this category. What is it? It is full of promises, that is for sure. Chiropractic tells us that you can improve virtually every aspect of health and decrease your aches, pains, and reduce your chance of illness. Well, before getting into just what it can and cannot do, it's always instructive to look at a bit of history to see where this has emerged from. Because as we try to emphasize, if you don't look backwards, you will not be able to know how to go forward. We have to learn from the past. We go back to the 18th century, and Anton Mesmer, who, of course, we remember because of the word mesmerism. Well, Mesmer was a legitimate trained physician at that time, learning about bloodletting, purging. I mean, that's what they learned about in those days. But he got very interested in magnets, specifically in lodestones. These are natural magnets. And of course, it is not surprising that someone would be interested in this because they are indeed very interesting. I mean, just think about it. You hold one of these magnets on one side of your hand, and it's going to attract a piece of metal on the other hand. Obviously, some form of energy or something is going through the tissues. So he wondered whether or not this could actually have healing properties. Could these magnets suck disease out of the body? And of course, hindsight is 2020, but they didn't know very much about science back in those days. And he was very impressed when he had his patients hold on to magnetized rods. And indeed, underneath this table here was a bucket of magnetized water. And so they were holding on to these rods, dipping into so-called magnetized water, which is interesting because water does not have any magnetic properties and it cannot be magnetized. However, the patients sang the praises of this therapy. The placebo effect, undoubtedly. But he very quickly realized that it wasn't even important for people to hold on to these magnetized rods because healthy people exuded what he called this animal magnetism. So all you had to do was to be close to someone who was healthy and absorb this healing magnetic energy. He actually set up a clinic in Paris to cater to the rich young hypochondriacs, mostly women, and he hired good-looking young men who would administer the magnetic therapy. And as the word goes, actually in his own diary, some of these ladies had to be taken to the back room for further therapy, which was never elucidated upon. Anyway, King Louis XVI was somewhat suspicious of all of this, and he thought that it needed investigating. And he asked a committee to be formed, and it included Benjamin Franklin, who at that time was U.S. ambassador to France, Joseph Guillotine, who was a physician, who suggested that the guillotine would do away with people mercifully better than if they were drawn and quartered, and Antoine Lavoisier, who was the leading French scientist at that time. And they came out with a report. And they claimed that indeed there was no real healing here. It all came from the imagination. The healing was all in the imagination, they said. Well, yes, that may have been true, but that doesn't mean it's useless. If you have a different perception of your symptoms and you feel better because of that, that is something. Of course, there's no underlying physiological effect. In any case, because of Mesmer, the whole idea of magnetic therapy took off. And there were all kinds of gimmicks that were sold. Here's an electrogalvanic belt. Well, this came about when electricity was seen to be connected to magnetism. And there were many other such items. Magneto garments. You would wear this garment with speckled with magnets. You would comb your hair with an electromagnetic brush. While these are remnants of a bygone era, believe it or not, there are similar devices today. Here's a modern version of Mesmer's magnetic water. And as I said, water cannot be magnetized, so this really doesn't do anything. But you plug it into the electricity and you drink the magnetized water. But if you don't want this rather expensive gimmick, you can just buy this cup, which will magnetize water that you pour into it. Well, today, there's all kinds of belief in magnetic therapy. There are articles, there are books written on it. It can look very, very seductive as they make arguments about what magnets can do, about how our body needs magnetic energy, and how the Earth's magnetic energy is fading, and therefore we need to treat ourselves with magnets of all kinds. They can be placed on the back, or they can be placed inside of your shoe, or you can wear them on your wrist. Or you can also shell out a great deal of money to lie underneath these magnetic arms. And there are many versions of this. The magnetosphere is even more elaborate. And of course, it is supposed to suck all disease out of the body. What is curious is that they try to justify this by referring to MRI machines, which of course work on the basis of magnetism. And they want people to conclude that because MRI machines do such wonderful things, therefore the magnetosphere must also work. Well, yes, an MRI machine does use the principle of magnetism, but it is a diagnostic device. It is not a treatment device. And it does look for small magnetized locales in the body, which come about when large magnets, that's what you're looking at here, that's what an MRI machine is, causes protons, which are tiny little magnets in the body, to align in a certain way. And when you shut off the external magnetic field, the relaxation of those protons results in an image, and that has various kind of possible interpretations. Well, anyway, back in the heyday of magnetism, just after Mesmer, there were all kinds of people who got into the magnetizer game. They became healers. And one of the classic ones was Paul Castor, who claimed that his hands had healing abilities because he could exude a magnetic force, very much like Mesmer's animal magnetism. And you can see he's surrounded here by crutches, which supposedly people threw away after he treated them. Well, one of his students was Daniel David Palmer, who is the founder of chiropractic. The word chiro comes from the ancient Greek meaning hand. And he was a magnetic healer using only his hands, not even touching the body. But he learned that if he would just hold his hands above the body, this had a healing effect. He opened up a healing office in this building, which was in Davenport, Iowa, started with one room, and he very quickly became successful. And first he took over a couple of adjacent rooms and then a whole floor in the building, and he converted this into a school of magnetic cure, saying that his treatment did not require any drugs at all, which was not a bad thing in those days because there were really no effective drugs. And you can see, he said, our healing is done entirely by the hands. There are no drugs used. You can eat or drink what you please within reason. We use no electrical batteries, no instruments. Anyone can step into our treating rooms. And he called himself a magnetic manipulator. And his magnetic treatments used only his hands. His son eventually described his father's magnetic treatments. As you can see, the patient would lie down and he would just hover his hands above and below the patient. In this case, the problem was in the liver, and the magnetic force would result in a treatment and in a cure, hopefully. He would publish his results in a magazine that he founded called The Magnetic Cure. And for 10 years, he pursued this activity of being a magnetic healer. And then came a breakthrough. There was a janitor in that building, the Ryan building in Davenport. And this janitor had a problem. He had a hearing difficulty. He didn't hear very well. And believe it or not, that was the beginning of chiropractic. How so? Well, there are many different stories about how this gentleman, Harvey Lillard, had his hearing restored. But the story that is very often promoted, that Palmer noticed when the gentleman bent down that there was a protrusion in his back, and he thought that perhaps that was the cause of the hearing problem. And when he he pushed on this protrusion. Supposedly, the hearing was restored. Now, there are many versions of this story, and even the chiropractic historians cannot agree on exactly what happened. One says that it was all in the context of a group of them getting together. A joke was being told, and Palmer just hit this guy on the back of on his back. And, when they were laughing merrily, and that's when he noticed that there was something out of place, which he accidentally pushed back into place. Who knows? Anyway, supposedly Harvey Lillard said that his hearing was restored, although, of course, we have no way of knowing who actually wrote this little piece in the newspaper. But the chiropractors, of course, are very adamant that this was the first chiropractic treatment. There's even a memorial in Davenport, Iowa, and it's right in front of the building, which is no longer there. That this is where the Lillard miracle took place, and this is where Palmer came to the conclusion that illnesses are caused by what he called subluxations, these misalignments of the spine. And then he switched from magnetic healing to hands-on manipulation. And according to Palmer, 95% of all disease is due to these subluxations. And these subluxations mean that nerves are being squeezed. And if you can relieve the pressure on the nerves, then the body will go on and heal itself of whatever disease there is. He opened up a school. As you can see, he was into opening up schools. First, it was magnetic healing, and now he thought that chiropractic deserved its own school. And he opened up the School of Chiropractic, much to the annoyance of physicians at that time who claimed that he was practicing medicine without a license. And the government agreed, and Palmer actually ended up going to jail. Instead of paying a fine, he was offered to pay a fine. He decided to go to jail instead because that made him into a martyr. And then he had even more publicity. His son, Bartlett Joshua Palmer, was one of his main disciples, and he introduced one of the main tenets of chiropractic: early to bed, early to rise, work like hell, and advertise. He didn't get along very well with his father. All kinds of stories about that too. There were even some allegations that when his father died, it was because he had a confrontation with his son, that he was hit by his son's car. None of that is documented because, of course, this was before any kind of visual records. So we don't really know, but we do know that they didn't get along very well. Both of the Palmers were adamant that the only treatment that chiropractors should pursue is manipulation of subluxations with their hands. Today, of course, because scientific medicine has evolved and shadow has been cast on this methodology, chiropractic is divided into two versions. There are the so-called straight chiropractors who still believe that all they should be doing is pushing on the back of a patient, and they still claim that they can basically somehow allow the body to cure itself of whatever disease by aligning the spine. And then there are the mixers who stray from this in various ways. First of all, they use tools that the straight chiropractors don't use. These tools can be very simple, or they can look very impressive, such as this spine decompressor. Some of the tools that they use are just absurd, like this one here, stem cell machine. There's no such thing as a stem cell machine that can do anything for stem cells. And many chiropractors today also get into the area of nutrition, in which they have practically no training in their chiropractic schools, and they sell various kinds of supplements out of their offices. This is a big money maker. And as you can see, these are branded as chiropractors supplements. And there are all kinds of protein supplements, cholesterol-lowering supplements. And it gives you the impression that they were designed by a chiropractor who supposedly has some special knowledge. Well, chiropractors do not have any special knowledge in nutrition, and certainly not in pharmacology. And furthermore, they are not adept at making up any kind of dietary supplement. They don't have to be, because this can be made up by a company and you can put whatever label you want on it. This is the chiropractor's cholesterol treatment. Here's the doctor's cholesterol treatment. It's exactly the same thing, bought from one company, and you just put your own label on it. These days, of course, with COVID, chiropractors have had to adapt their practice, and they certainly have. Now, the claim is that these adjustments of the spine can improve immunity. There's zero evidence for this. It isn't even clear, how one would ever measure improved immunity, but they can do this. Not only that, they can put a number to it. Chiropractic adjustments boost the immune system by 200%. Of course, there's no discussion, there's no evidence for where they get such a number. They also suggest that pregnant women need to have prenatal chiropractic adjustments to make sure that the baby comes out healthy. And as soon as the baby comes out healthy, the baby needs adjustments so that health is maintained through the life. And there are all kinds of adjustments, including the baby's adjustment of the neck. And this is certainly an issue when physicians are concerned and skeptics of chiropractic are concerned, because there have been cases where manipulation of the neck has resulted in terrible injuries, including strokes because of a tear in the carotid artery. And while this is certainly not an extensive situation, it does happen. And there are a number of recorded cases where people have suffered a stroke because of manipulation of their neck. The chiropractors, of course, say that this is not true, that there is no increased incidence. However, numerous scientific papers have been published on this, documenting the fact that chiropractic adjustments of the neck, in rare cases, and certainly it is rare, but because there are so many chiropractic adjustments every year, there are a number of cases every year. So chiropractors, of course, have been extensively criticized because of this. So there's this ongoing battle between chiropractors and physicians about just what the risks are. And Simon Singh, who's an excellent skeptic and scientific writer, got into a lot of trouble because he wrote a piece in a British newspaper, The Guardian, where he said that chiropractic happily promotes bogus treatments. And the chiropractors sued, and this became a big story. It was an ongoing lawsuit because they said that this was defamatory, suggesting that their treatments were bogus. But there was a lot of back and forth, and a lot of the skeptical organizations got behind Simon Singh, and eventually the Chiropractic Association gave in, and Simon Singh won the libel battle. At least he wasn't judged to have carried out any kind of libelous discussion. So this is where chiropractic kind of stands. There is some evidence that if you have low back pain, chiropractic adjustment can temporarily relieve that pain. And because back pain is the most widespread human problem, obviously there are lots of visits to chiropractors, and because they have success with some low back pain, they get a lot of positive publicity because of that. But when you take a look at what they can and cannot do for any other disease, there's just no evidence that chiropractic adjustments can treat anything other than certain musculoskeletal problems. So next time you want to contemplate going to the chiropractor, you want to do some reading before and see just what the potential benefits are and what the potential risks are.
Speaking of reading and Simon Singh, I would highly recommend the book that he co-wrote with Dr. Edzard Ernst. It's called Trick or Treatment. It's a little bit hard to find, though, but it is so good. I mean, it's extremely well researched, very well written book about chiropractic, but also about acupuncture, herbal medicine, homeopathy, and a few others.
It's excellent. And basically everything that Edzard Ernst does is very good. Yeah, Trick or Treatment is an excellent book. And of course, there are many books written on chiropractic on both sides, obviously, and many articles. So, it means that if you want to really understand it, you got to do some work, you got to do some reading. I've been following this now for 40 years because, maybe 35 years. I wrote a column in the Montreal Gazette 35 years ago about the possibility of strokes. And so the chiropractors, of course, attacked, and they asked for a meeting, which we had, and they tried to convince me, and we've had some back and forth. But interestingly enough, I've met a number of chiropractors in this connection, and some of them are totally outrageous, but some are in fact good. I would say is that they are, while of course they still believe that low back pain can be treated with adjustments, which may be, they don't believe anything else. So they don't sell supplements out of their offices. They don't use any of these machines. So one cannot paint all chiropractors, with one brush.
I'm reminded of, is it Sam Hamola, who wrote also a lot for Science-Based Medicine many years ago?
A chiropractor.
Right.
Yeah. And of course, you get a lot of good information when you have someone who's been involved in some practice and has had their eyes opened. Just like we've seen with naturopathy.
Britt Hermes.
With Britt Hermes, yeah. So anyway, chiropractic is, it's interesting. It's a fascinating history because D.D. Palmer had no education whatsoever. He was the son of a grocer. His experience was selling fish in his father's store until he came upon this magnetic healer who he saw was making money. So he thought, this is a good game to get into. Yeah. And then there was the Lillard story, and who knows whether it's true or not. It's one of these things, gets repeated often enough and becomes true by repetition. All right, so there's our story for today. Learn something about vaccines and how careful you have to be before you jump on any kind of bandwagon. Okay, so that's it for today. Hope you've been informed and entertained as well. And we will see you next month, hopefully with a bigger cast. Okay, bye everyone.